The city was unbearably hot, with temperatures soaring above 30 degrees Celsius in the courtyards of the high-rise buildings. A young pregnant woman wandered aimlessly. She carefully scanned the house numbers on the street corners but couldn't find the address she was looking for. On a bench in a gazebo, elderly women, sad and gross in gossip, Irene approached them, sat down wearily beside them, and rubbed her lower back. Her long dress clung unpleasantly to her body, and her sneakers dug into her swollen feet. She asked, "Good day. Can you help me find house number 7? I've walked the entire street, and I'm out of energy. My phone's dead too. It's like this house doesn't even exist." One of the elderly women perked up immediately and said, "Hello there, I'll tell you everything you need to know. My daughter-in-law lives in that house. When you leave this courtyard, turn left. There's a store, and right after that, you'll find house number 7. I know everyone there. Who are you visiting?" Irene replied, "I am here in response to an ad for selling baby items. Buying stuff at regular stores is too expensive, and used items are more affordable." Irene thanked the woman, got up wearily, and headed to the house. The apartment she needed was on the 9th floor, and Irene pressed the elevator call button. Like in many high-rise buildings, the elevator took an agonizingly long time to arrive. It was scratched and dirty, with graffiti on the walls. Irene began to calculate whether she had enough money for both the envelope needed for the maternity discharge and the baby onesie. Perhaps she should haggle a bit. Abruptly, the elevator stopped, and the lights went out. Irene hadn't even realized which floor she was on. She began pressing the elevator call button repeatedly, but it was in vain. The elevator seemed frozen and showed no signs of life. Panic washed over Irene. She had always been afraid of elevators since getting stuck between floors once for 2 whole hours. She would never have entered one now if she weren't pregnant. Climbing to the 9th floor on foot in this heat was out of the question. Irene grew angrier and kicked the elevator door. She pressed all the buttons in desperation, hoping that something would make it move. Suddenly, she began to feel lightheaded, sweat poured down her temples and back, blurring her vision. The air was becoming scarce, and her back and lower abdomen started to ache. Irene pounded the doors with her fists and shouted, "Someone help! People, I'm stuck in the elevator. I'm pregnant, and I feel unwell. Please help me." But time passed, and no one rushed to her aid. During the daytime, everyone was at work, and few people passed by. Irene cried and realized that she was going into real labor. She whispered, "God, help me. Do I really have to give birth alone in this filthy elevator?" With her last bit of strength, practically losing consciousness from pain and panic, she tried once more to pry open the doors and shouted, "Help! I'm giving birth. Someone, people, save me." To her luck, a young athletic guy named Bradley was descending in the elevator. He respected sports and didn't use the elevator, believing that walking was very beneficial for one's health. The young man heard the desperate cries of the woman, quickly realized that the elevator had malfunctioned again, and immediately called for an ambulance. He also called the emergency dispatcher. "Have you all gone completely mad? The elevator in the 7th building is stuck again, and a pregnant woman is in labor. Release her immediately. How long will this madness continue? It's the same thing every week. You only pretend to be fixing it." Upon hearing this, the elevator repairman instantly grabbed the necessary tools and rushed to rescue the woman in labor. Meanwhile, Bradley tried to comfort the poor woman through the door. "Just don't panic, breathe deeply, stay calm. The ambulance is on its way, and a technician is coming too. They will help you. How are you doing in there, ma'am? Can you hear me?" Irene screamed in pain once again and began to slump to the floor, trying to respond, "I'm giving birth. I feel unwell. Please save me," and she fell into darkness. Bradley was so worried about the stranger that he began to attempt to pry the door open himself, and miraculously, he succeeded. With one foot, he held the door while carefully pulling the woman out onto the landing. Neighbors rushed to the scene, laid a blanket and a pillow for her, and began splashing her with water. But Irene remained unconscious. Just then, the repairman arrived, explaining that it wasn't his fault, the elevator was just too old. Finally, an ambulance team arrived, and they immediately placed the poor woman on a stretcher and carried her to the vehicle. Calling out to Bradley, "Are you her husband? Get in, you are coming with us. We don't know what might happen, it's a serious situation. There's been bleeding, and we're not sure if she'll make it." Bradley was in such shock that he got in and went along, worrying deeply for this young woman he didn't even know. What if something terrible happened? What if she died or lost her baby? What a disaster it had turned into for him. He patiently waited in the hospital corridor and didn't know how to explain to the medical staff that he wasn't the father of the child and, moreover, he didn't even know the woman. He had simply helped her. But he didn't leave. He thought maybe she would need some help. The labor lasted an incredibly long time. Already 4 hours had passed, and suddenly, a nurse came out to Bradley and said, "Well, Dad, congratulations, you have a son. The baby is fine. Don't worry. But your wife is in worse condition. The delivery was very difficult, she lost a lot of blood. She's still in the intensive care unit, unconscious, but she's getting better. However, they won't let you see her now. Come back tomorrow, I'll write you a list of medications. You'll need to buy them, they will help her recover faster." Bradley nodded and went home without revealing the truth. Why he didn't know himself. He couldn't decide at that moment, and now it just felt awkward, a complicated situation, especially considering that Bradley was married. Upon returning home, his wife, Isabella, subjected him to a thorough interrogation. "Where have you been? And you didn't even buy bread. That's just too much. You were gone half the day, and you went out for just a minute. Did you drink?" Bradley responded irritably, "Isabella, please stop it. You know I don't drink alcohol at all. What's with this hysteria?" Something happened. He honestly told her the whole story, thinking that his wife would understand, maybe even commend him for helping a pregnant woman, but it turned out differently. Isabella was absolutely furious. "You're always like this, seeking adventures. What? You need more excitement than anyone else. Fine, you help open the elevator, but why did you go to the maternity hospital? Or maybe she's your lover, and is the baby yours? Why are you so concerned about a stranger?" Bradley just waved his hand. "What nonsense. I told you I don't even know her. I just helped the person. Enough of this, I'm done. I'll go buy some bread at last." Isabella immediately blocked the passage and sternly crossed her arms. "No, I won't let you go. You've already been out, you can eat without bread." Meanwhile, Irene finally woke up in the intensive care unit after a day and immediately screamed, "Where's my baby? What happened to him?" A doctor approached her and patiently explained, "Finally, Irene, you've regained consciousness. You really scared all of us, to be honest. Don't worry, your son is fine, a beautiful boy. But your condition was touch and go, we even had to perform an emergency blood transfusion. We saved you by a miracle. Now your condition has stabilized, and we're transferring you to a regular ward. Your son will be brought to you for feeding in an hour." Irene thanked the doctor. "Thank you, doctor, thank you so much. Can I ask someone to bring my belongings and everything needed for my son? My house key is in my bag, but they basically took me off the street. Thankfully, I always carry my ID and debit card with me." The doctor smiled. "Why ask someone else? Your husband has been sitting outside your room since morning, waiting for them to allow him in. He bought all the medications you needed and everything on the list, so everything is in order. He was so worried, all worked up while you were in labor. It's clear that he loves you very much." Irene stared at the doctor in astonishment, and she even turned pale. "Excuse me, what husband? What are you talking about? I've been a widow for 3 months. My husband Robert worked for a private security agency and died while transporting valuable coins. You probably heard about it in the news. It was a high-profile case. Those robbers showed no mercy to anyone. I don't know how I survived his death, especially since I was already pregnant. We were making plans, choosing a name for our baby together, and then this. As for the guy who claimed to be my husband, can I meet him? I'm actually curious to see what this comedy is all about. I can't wait to lay eyes on him." The doctor stepped out and invited Bradley to enter. The young man gathered his courage and began to explain from the threshold, "Congratulations on the birth of your son. I'm sorry that they mistook me for your husband. Remember I helped you get out of the stuck elevator yesterday. The ambulance crew decided I was your husband and asked me to go to the hospital with you. Well, I just didn't have the heart to tell the truth." Irene hadn't heard him at all. She crossed herself and whispered as if she were delusional, "Robert, my dear, you've come back. But how? I buried you. Can people really come back from there?" The woman fainted again, and a panicked Bradley rushed to call the medical staff. They quickly revived Irene. An annoyed doctor scolded Bradley, "What's going on here? Why are you pushing your wife to the point of losing consciousness? She's still weak, she doesn't need stress." Bradley realized that something absurd was happening and answered honestly, "I'm not her husband. My name is Bradley, and I just helped this woman get out of the elevator. We don't even know each other." But Irene started ming again as if in a trance. "Robert, what are you saying? You are my husband, my late husband. Oh God." And she burst into tears, wiping them away with the back of her hand before crossing herself once more. Bradley asked the doctor, "Could this be some kind of stress-induced confusion? She clearly thinks I'm her husband. Is that even possible?" The puzzled doctor tried to calm Irene down, saying, "Now, Irene, let's breathe and calm down. Let's sort this out without emotions. You've just experienced a shock, and this stress combined with the recent loss of your husband can lead to such reactions. I'll call a nurse to give you a sedative, and you can get some rest. Sound good? But in the long run, Irene, you should consider seeing a psychologist. This is a serious case from what I can see." The woman suddenly shouted, "Do you think I'm insane, doctor? Please, in my purse, in my wallet, there's a photo of Robert, my husband. I always carry it with me. Please bring it here. You'll understand that I'm telling the truth." The doctor obediently fetched her bag. When Irene pulled out a photo of her late husband, everyone was genuinely shocked. The man in the photograph was practically a twin of Bradley, except for slightly longer hair. The doctor involuntarily crossed himself and muttered, "I think I need a sedative too." "So what's happening here? Are you, dear sir, claiming to be Bradley while looking exactly like Irene's late husband, Robert?" A nurse entered the room and said, "Edgar, it's time for your meeting. You're running late." The doctor adjusted his glasses and said in a puzzled manner, "As you can see, it's time for me to go. You all can figure out for yourselves who the real husband is and who isn't. Feeding time in an hour, Irene. I'll come back after lunch." After the doctor left, Bradley began to explain himself. "I honestly don't understand how this could happen, Irene. We've never met before, that's for sure. I thought you were genuinely going crazy, but now I realize your husband must have looked remarkably like me, and you got confused. It's just incredible." Irene responded, "Bradley, you have to understand. It's impossible for complete strangers to look so much alike. I look at you, and I still get chills. Your voice, your expressions, your smile, everything is just like my Robert. You two must be identical twins. There's no other explanation." Bradley shook his head, saying, "No, I definitely don't know anyone like that. I grew up in the city. I'm an only child. My mother's name is Diane, and my father is Jimia. As far as I know, we don't have any relatives in the village. This has to be some kind of mistake." Irene insisted, "I need to get home before my wife starts scolding me again. Once again, congratulations on the birth of your son, and I sincerely sympathize with the loss of your husband. Is there anything else I can do for you?" Irene handed him the keys to her house and said, "Just one request. Please bring the bag from the corridor. I'll tell you the address of my house now. Everything we need is in there for me and my son. Thank you so much, Bradley, for saving both my life and my son's life." Bradley agreed to help Irene once again and headed to her house to fetch her belongings. The bag was indeed in the corridor, ready to be picked up. However, out of curiosity, Bradley walked through the house. He was stunned when he saw a photo of Irene's husband in a black mourning frame on her bedside table. The resemblance was truly unbelievable. Could it be that Irene is right, and her late husband is my identical twin brother? I need to go see my parents today and have a serious talk with them. There must be a logical explanation for this phenomenon. Bradley dropped off the bag for Irene and asked her for a photo of her husband from her wallet to ensure he had a direct answer. Then he headed straight to his parents' house. On the way, he kept thinking, comparing facts, and recalling his childhood, but he couldn't find a single instance or moment when he could suspect that he wasn't his parents' biological son. His mother still loved him dearly, and his father had poured his heart into his upbringing. How could this be if Robert was indeed his brother? Why did they grow up separately, knowing nothing about each other? Bradley entered his parents' apartment. His mother, upon seeing her son, joyfully rushed to hug him. "My dear, come in. You are such a good son to visit your parents." Father also came out to greet his son, shaking his hand and exchanging greetings. They all sat down together to have tea and cake that Bradley had brought. As always, his mother worried and began to inquire about everything. "So, how are things with Isabella? Are you still arguing, or have you patched things up? I worry so much about you, dear. How's work going? Is everything okay? You seem preoccupied. I can sense that something has happened." Bradley didn't know how to approach the most critical subject. He said, "Work is fine, no issues, and things with Isabella are as usual. You know her temperament, we have our moments. But something unusual happened recently. Just listen." He honestly recounted everything to his parents and then placed the photo of Robert on the table. With a sigh of relief, he cautiously asked, "Mom, can strangers be so strikingly similar? It's as if this man in the photo and I are the same person. Honestly, I don't understand it, but I need to know the whole truth." He looked at his mother with anticipation. She glanced at the photo, turned pale, and burst into tears, whispering, "Robert, my dear, did you really pass away so young? How could this happen? Please forgive me for everything." The answer was evident. Robert was indeed his brother. His father, too, appeared perplexed, nervously taking his glasses on and off. Diane took a deep breath and began to recall her distant youth. "I was 18 at the time, and your father, Carl, was 25. We had such a passionate love, like Romeo and Juliet. We would fight and make up, but our parents never approved of us being together. They believed we were a mismatch. However, fate had other plans. I became pregnant soon after, and we had to settle our differences and get married. I gave birth to twins, you Bradley and your brother Robert. However, as soon as the two infants arrived, our married life took a difficult turn. I was exhausted, couldn't keep up with everything, and Carl was no help. He'd come home late from work, drank on the weekends, and eventually decided to cheat on me. We had terrible arguments, and after a year, we decided to divorce because living together became impossible. Carl insisted on equally dividing the children, so to speak. He took your brother and went to his hometown to his parents. I stayed with you. We despised each other so much at the time that we agreed never to cross paths again, erase each other from our lives, and ensure that our children didn't know about each other. That's how it turned out. For years, I knew nothing about Robert's fate, but I often thought about him and remembered. It's only now when you told me he had passed away that I realized the gravity of our actions. My Robert is no longer in this world. There's no way to undo it, and I can't ask for forgiveness. That's the story, my son. Your mother is far from saintly. This secret has tormented me all these years. While the law was on our side, morally, it was all wrong. Bradley was in shock. He kept standing, then sitting back down, then pacing back and forth in the kitchen. Mom, how can this be? I just can't believe it. What have you done? Why did you separate us from our brother forever? This is absurd. I understand that you and Dad got divorced, but what do we have to do with it? Why did you forbid us from meeting, from being friends? How is that fair? So Irene was right. Robert is my brother, and her son is my nephew, and your grandchild for that matter. And the poor woman is going crazy thinking she's all alone in the world with no one to help her. Is that right, Mom? Answer me. How could you live your life calmly raising me without a heavy heart for your second son? I'm sorry, but I just can't understand this. I need to go now. The woman, in a frenzy, grabbed her son's sleeve and pleaded, "Forgive me, my son. I beg you, don't distance yourself from us now. Please, we love you more than life itself." But Bradley pulled away from her grip and said, "Sure, of course, I'll call." He rushed out onto the street, feeling like he couldn't breathe, with a massive lump in his throat, wanting to howl, roll on the ground, and cry like a little child. Thoughts were swirling in his head, creating a dreadful chaos. How could my mother do this? Why did she and Dad treat us so cruelly? How can you divide children as if they were property, not living beings? With trembling hands, Bradley dialed Irene's phone number, but then he hung up. No, he couldn't upset her now. She was taking care of the baby. He needed to regain his composure first and then tell her everything. However, he now firmly knew that he wouldn't abandon this woman. He would help her in every way. Irene had no one else to rely on. For the memory of his brother, he felt obligated to take care of his brother's wife and child. His mobile phone rang, and it was Isabella calling. Bradley thought irritably, "Here comes the tantrum." Indeed, his wife was screaming on the phone as if she had lost her mind. "Bradley, where the hell are you? You've been gone all day." He didn't want to argue, he simply didn't have the energy left. He replied quietly, "Isabella, I'll be home soon, and I'll explain everything." He knew his wife's confrontational nature, but still hoped that she would understand and support him. Perhaps she would also grow to love Irene's child and establish a connection with him. After all, they were not strangers. However, contrary to his expectations, a deafening argument erupted at home. Isabella yelled so loudly that it felt like her words were clogging his ears. "Are you insane? What brother? What nephew? Do you think I'm a complete idiot? Will believe all these tales? Just admit that this child is yours from your mistress. I knew it all along. You're spending all your time with her now. So this is where you disappear for entire days." His wife lunged at him, attempting to strike him, but Bradley was in no mood to tolerate it. He was stunned by his wife's outrageous tantrum. "Try hitting me. I've had enough of your scenes. I thought you would understand and support me, but you don't. Go crazy. I don't have any mistress, and I won't abandon Irene, and I will raise my nephew. The conversation is over. He slammed the door and locked himself in the bedroom. Bradley thought, how long can these scandals continue? Is this even a family? She's more like a monster than a wife. And to think I used to like Isabella's character. Isabella, on the other hand, remained upset until late at night, mentally accusing Bradley of being a cheater and a traitor. It never occurred to her that her husband wasn't lying. She was in a combative mood, thinking, well, that's all right. I didn't get married for this, to share Bradley with some lady. We'll see how this plays out, but he's so audacious. Instead of confessing and apologizing for his affair, he's spinning these tales. Despite the wild family quarrel, Bradley arrived at the hospital for Irene's discharge with flowers and balloons. He couldn't miss such an event. Irene came out looking happy, holding her precious child close to her heart. She was pleasantly surprised by the attention Bradley, her husband's brother, was showing to her and her son. Other women were being picked up by their husbands, and she didn't want to leave the hospital alone. When she saw Bradley, a million emotions swirled within her. On one hand, he was an exact copy of Robert, and he looked at her with the same tenderness, making her want to rush into his strong arms like in the past and feel loved and happy again. But she kept reminding herself, snap out of it. This is wrong. Bradley is not Robert, and he's married. However, her logical reasoning was at odds with the desires of her heart, which had been tormented by longing. Bradley started helping Irene often, taking little Paul for walks in the park, escorting them to doctor's appointments, and providing for their material needs, buying groceries, and everything else required. He considered it his duty and found great pleasure in spending time with them. Unlike the confrontational and noisy Isabella, Irene was quiet, thoughtful, and very house-proud. Her home was always clean and cozy, with a special pleasant atmosphere that soothed Bradley. One day, Bradley finally mustered the courage to ask Irene, tell me everything about Robert's death. Something feels strange to me. I want to know who killed my brother. These scoundrels must be held accountable for their actions and not continue to enjoy life. It's a matter of honor, you know. Irene sighed and began to recount, even though these memories were very painful for her. Robert worked for a private security firm and was highly regarded by his superiors. On that occasion, he was assigned to accompany a well-known individual who was transporting valuable antique coins. It seemed like a routine task, protect the valuable property until the deal was completed. But on the way to the agency's car, they were attacked by gangsters and shot. This happened in a remote area, so there were no witnesses. My Robert and two other security guards were killed on the spot, riddled with multiple gunshot wounds. They never regained consciousness. The coins were stolen, and they were not in the car. That's all I know. I still can't come to terms with Robert's death. I cry into my pillow at night. Bradley furrowed his brow, saying, listen, can you give me the address of this security agency? I want to talk to its owner. Maybe we can find out something. It's a strange case, don't you think? How could the gangsters have known about the impending deal, and how did they manage to ambush them in such a convenient place? Irene became alarmed, saying, Bradley, maybe we shouldn't do this. I won't survive it if something happens to you too. You're the closest person to me now, and you take such good care of us. Bradley hurried to reassure her, saying, don't worry. Come on. Isn't it unfair that Robert is no longer here, and your son is growing up without a father, while the killers are still free? Someone has to seek the truth. The next day, Bradley decided to visit the owner of the security agency. He had a plan in mind and was counting on it. He confidently entered the chief's office and began the conversation right away, saying, well, hello, Ken. How are you? Does your conscience bother you? Do the dead haunt you at night? Seeing Bradley, Ken jumped up and started backing away towards the window. He stammered, "Robert, this can't be. You're supposed to be dead. I was personally at your funeral. Are you back from the afterlife, or am I going crazy?" He began rubbing his eyes and shaking his head in an attempt to dispel this hallucination. Bradley chuckled, "Hell scared. I'll be coming to see you every day until you tell the truth. I know you're involved in my murder. Confess, you scoundrel." Ken broke into a cold sweat. He felt nauseous, fear penetrated every fiber of his body. He couldn't bear it any longer and started talking, "Leave, disappear, please. I'll tell you everything. Just go. My people killed you. They even sent me photos as proof. There was so much money at stake. Do you even realize how much those damn coins are worth? It's a fortune. But fate had it out for me. When they delivered those boxes of coins, and I opened them, they were filled with nothing but sand, plain sand in bags. Someone found out about the deal before me and outsmarted me, leaving me with nothing. Are you satisfied now? Now go. I've told you the truth. What more do you want, Robert?" Bradley turned off the recorder in his pocket and said, "You're a murderer, and you'll answer for everything." Ken rushed out of the office and immediately called the police, waiting for them in a nearby park. Bradley was shaking, his thoughts were in turmoil, but he rejoiced, thinking, "I did it. This idiot believed I was a ghost. Now he'll pay for everything, scoundrel. Can you hear me, brother? I found your murderer." Ken was taken to the police station, and Bradley provided the investigator with the recording from the dictaphone with his confession. Under pressure from the investigation, the agency owner confessed to everything and implicated his accomplices. The case was solved, and the villains received prison sentences for their crimes. However, even the experienced investigator couldn't uncover the main mystery: who had actually stolen those valuable coins, and where did they disappear to? If they had tried to steal them, the police would have known about it instantly. But it was as if they had vanished into thin air. Relationships between Bradley and Isabella were deteriorating rapidly, and they hardly communicated anymore. Isabella had gone completely mad, interrogating her husband with suspicion every day. If he was late, she searched him, looking for signs of infidelity in his belongings, his bag, and his phone. She was utterly obsessed with this idea, and no matter how much Bradley assured her that he was helping Irene solely for the sake of his nephew, she didn't believe him. Although Bradley knew that there was some truth in her words, yes, there was nothing between him and Irene, but he desperately wanted a romantic relationship with her. He had a deep admiration for Robert's wife, and he had grown very attached to Paul. After all, he had pleaded with Isabella to have a child for so long, and she had always refused, coming up with excuses each time: her career, the timing wasn't right, and so on. Now, when Robert's wife felt the threat to her family and was ready to get pregnant and have a child, Bradley no longer needed it. He increasingly found himself thinking that he didn't love Isabella anymore. The emotional warmth and harmony between them had long disappeared, even before he met Irene, and the spark of passion that initially brought them together had long faded. All that remained was a bitter aftertaste and complete disillusionment. Irene, too, couldn't make sense of her feelings. She eagerly anticipated each meeting with Bradley. She felt so comfortable and happy around him. But maybe she still loved the image of her Robert. How could she be sure? Her soul was in complete turmoil. On one hand, she was drawn to Bradley like a magnet, and she couldn't do anything about it. On the other hand, Irene knew that Robert's brother was married, and she had no right to cross that line. Moreover, she thought that Bradley was helping her out of pity. She felt that if she succumbed to temptation, she would betray her beloved Robert. So, Irene and Bradley continued to be friends, but there was always something more in the air. But Isabella was absolutely certain about her feelings. She had no doubts. She fiercely hated this Irene, who seemed to have appeared out of nowhere, along with her child. Isabella saw her as a rival and harbored a cunning plan, dreaming of revenge. She was used to Bradley's love and compliance, his indulgence of all her whims, and he did not refuse her. Besides, he provided for her quite well financially. As for love, Isabella had always been pragmatic and had never believed in all these romantic stories. And now, what? Her husband was infatuated with this widow, and he had completely gone out of control. He even gave her part of his salary. The more Isabella yelled and demanded that her husband stop communicating with Irene, the further he distanced himself from his wife. The effect was quite the opposite. Isabella realized that without this child, Bradley would have stopped visiting Irene. One day, she decided to take a desperate step. On that day, as usual, Irene was strolling in the park with her little one. She admired the golden leaves and basked in the warm sun. Paul was fast asleep in the stroller. Irene checked her watch. It was almost 6 o'clock in the evening. Bradley was about to arrive. After all, her little one would soon take his first steps. Irene took out her mirror and glanced at herself, adjusting a lock of hair that had strayed from her hairstyle, and smiled at herself. She always felt better in anticipation of a meeting with her beloved Robert. Then, out of nowhere, a stranger in a tracksuit and a hood suddenly appeared from an alley. She rushed towards Irene and sprayed something into her face from a gas canister, saying, "This is for all your troubles." Irene screamed in agony from the sharp pain in her eyes. It stung so much that she completely lost her orientation for a split second and only regained consciousness when she heard her son crying. To her horror, the baby's cries were getting farther away, but Irene couldn't see anything. Her eyes were tearing up terribly. She found the stroller by touch, but it was empty. In a panic, she shouted in someone else's voice, "People, help! They've kidnapped my child." Bystanders rushed over and followed the stranger's trail, but she was already gone. Irene fumbled for her phone in her pocket and asked someone in the crowd to dial Bradley's number and call for an ambulance and the police. A man rushed over, startled, and found a heartbreaking scene in the park. The grief-stricken mother was crying, clutching her head and shaking the empty stroller as if her baby was still in it. She cried out, "Paul, my little boy, where are you? Where should I look for you? I can't bear this. I'll die without you. Lord, why is all this happening to me?" A frightened Bradley held her close like a small child, trying to comfort her. "Irene, please calm down. Get yourself together, I beg you. Your son's life depends on what you remember and tell us now. Take a deep breath and answer some questions. How did this happen? Who kidnapped your baby?" Bradley managed to calm Irene somewhat, and she began to describe all the details to him and the police officer, trying not to miss anything. Patrol officers searched all the streets, alleys, and train stations, but it was in vain. Paul was nowhere to be found. According to Irene's description, the kidnapper was a slim woman in her 30s, dressed inconspicuously in a gray tracksuit with a shoulder bag. Unfortunately, they couldn't create a clear composite sketch, as Irene's vision was still severely impaired. Her eyes were swollen and painful. At the police station, Irene was asked once again, "Think carefully. Can you think of anyone who might want to seek revenge on you? Did you have any enemies? It's just bizarre." Irene had an excruciating headache. She was swollen from crying and could only repeat, like a broken record, "I don't know. I didn't have any enemies. Please return my son to me. Tell me, is he okay? Where should I look for Paul now?" Bradley, for the 100th time, reviewed the descriptions, thought, and analyzed. And then it struck him. The suspicion was so horrifying that he didn't even want to believe it. He mechanically dialed his wife's number, but she was unreachable. So Bradley rushed home, but there was no one there. And then he remembered that Isabella had a great tracksuit. He rummaged through all her belongings, but couldn't find it. He had no doubts now. He called his wife again and again, but to no avail. He grabbed her address book, called all her friends, and no one knew anything. No one had seen Isabella's visitors. Bradley began to rummage through his wife's things chaotically, not even knowing what he was looking for. And then he found a picture in her bathrobe pocket. It was a photo of little Paul. Bradley had taken it as a keepsake, hoping that Isabella, upon seeing what a charming nephew he had, would want to meet him too. On the back of the photo, the word hate was written, and the photo itself had been punctured with a knife. All the pieces of the puzzle fell into place for Bradley. He felt queasy and rushed back to the police station, showing everything to the officers and shouting, "I figured it out. It's Isabella, my wife. She kidnapped my nephew. She was insanely jealous of my relationship with Irene. She didn't believe that I was helping her out of family ties and thought Irene was my lover. I tried to reason with her, explained that it wasn't true, but it was as if she couldn't hear me. But I never thought she'd go this far. Lord, I can't wrap my head around this. Why did she do this? Where is she hiding Paul, and what does she intend to do with him?" Irene seemed to lose her mind. She jumped up, grabbed Bradley by the lapels of his jacket, and screamed, "It's all your fault. If my son dies, it's on your conscience." Then she suddenly dropped to her knees, sobbing and whispering, "Bradley, my dear, please find Paul. He's the meaning of my life. After Robert's death, my son is everything to me. I love him more than anything." The police officers were taken aback, and then they decided not to further distress the grief-stricken mother. So they released her. However, realizing that she shouldn't be left alone at this time, they asked paramedics to keep an eye on her. Irene was taken to the hospital by an ambulance, while Bradley stayed at the police station. He had to help find his nephew. The investigator began to speculate aloud, so let's think logically. Your wife, as you say, is consumed by hatred. Consider this, is she capable of the worst? Can she harm the child? That's the main question now. Bradley waved his hands in disbelief. No, no way. Isabella may be unstable and hot-tempered, yes, but she's not a murderer. When we go to our country house, she even takes care of stray animals. And why would she take on such a sin? I don't think going to prison was part of her plan. She loves herself too much and enjoys a comfortable life. The investigators suddenly became more animated. Where is your country house located? Maybe that's where your wife has hidden the child. After all, we checked all the train stations, and no one purchased a ticket with such a young child. Does Isabella drive a car? Bradley responded, "We do have a car, but my wife doesn't drive, and she doesn't even have a driver's license. And the country house is 50 kilometers away from the city. Do you think she's there? But why would she take the baby to such a remote and deserted place? You see, women in states of jealousy and aggression can be unpredictable. We can't afford to waste any time, every minute counts. Are you coming with us?" On the way, a police officer kept making calls and giving orders to colleagues. Check with taxi drivers. It's possible that the kidnapper took a taxi. She must have found a way to get to the country house. And also, show Isabella's photo at the children's store. It's right on the outskirts of town. She snatched the child from a stroller, so she must intend to feed him. I hope. I'm afraid to consider any other possibilities. An hour later, Bradley and the police officers arrived at the country house. Bradley opened the door with his keys, and they searched the entire place, but neither Isabella nor the baby were there. Nor were there any other signs of someone's presence. They were once again at a dead end, unsure of what to do next. And then, an overly curious neighbor inadvertently helped them. He mentioned that he had seen a strange woman hanging around the house not too long ago. He didn't notice a child, but she had a hefty bag slung over her shoulder. She had been asking neighbors if there was any vacant housing in the village, and she had also visited another grandmother. In short, she seemed rather odd and nervous. The police officers rushed to the grandmother's house, and thankfully, Paul was there with Grandma Alyssa. Isabella, however, had disappeared without a trace. The old lady explained, "Oh, what a strange turn of events. I was planning to go to the police tomorrow. This woman came to me, brought the baby, and started saying something about taking care of the child, claiming he was sick and slept all the time. She left the baby with me and then ran off somewhere. So, take the child away. I don't want any trouble. I suspect you'll find her near the swamp. She was asking about a place to stay, and there's an abandoned house there." Bradley didn't waste any time and drove back to the city with his nephew. On the way, he called Irene. "Irene, we found Paul. I'm taking him to the hospital." Irene immediately screamed in a voice not her own, "To the hospital? What did she do to him?" "My baby. Is he okay?" Bradley hurriedly reassured her, "Don't panic. Paul is fine. He just slept for too long. The old lady suspects that she might have given him a sleeping pill. It's better to have the doctors check him out. So, you should come here too, and I'll be waiting for you." Irene couldn't remember how she got to the hospital. Her heart felt like it was about to burst out of her chest. She prayed to God for one thing only, "Lord, let everything be okay with Paul." Thankfully, everything was fine with the child. Isabella had indeed mixed a sleeping pill into his formula to keep him quiet. The doctors confirmed Paul's good health and discharged Irene and her son from the hospital. The poor woman didn't leave her son's side for a moment. She kissed and hugged him repeatedly. Then she began apologizing to Bradley, "Thank you for helping find Paul, and I'm sorry for getting so angry with you back at the police station. I wasn't myself, I was overwhelmed with grief. Thank God everything turned out well, but I still don't understand why your wife did all of this. Have they found her?" Bradley sighed heavily, "I'm still in shock myself. I never expected Isabella to be capable of this. I feel guilty in front of you and Paul. You're right, this all happened because of me. One thing I know for sure is that I can't live with her anymore. Well, she'll get what she deserves, stealing someone else's child. Can you believe it?" Irene said quietly, "I want to talk to her. It's important for me to know why she did this." Isabella was taken into custody, facing a substantial prison sentence for child abduction. All traces of hatred seemed to have evaporated, and the detention center quickly sobered her up. It was only now dawning on her the gravity of what she had done. She sat in a corner on a dirty mattress, staring in horror at the damp and moldy walls, an enormous spider in the corner, and the prison food, recoiling in disgust. Isabella couldn't help but think, "My God, what have I done?" Despite Bradley's protests, Irene requested a meeting with Isabella. She was somewhat apprehensive, considering Isabella mentally unstable. Irene thought that Isabella would curse her, but things turned out quite differently. A quiet and subdued woman was led into the meeting room. She appeared attractive and well-groomed, and one could never tell she was capable of such actions. Her eyes were not filled with malice, but rather fear and a sense of inevitability. Irene took a deep breath and began the conversation. "Isabella, I come here with one purpose. I don't need your apologies or remorse, I don't believe in them. I need the truth. Why did you attack me in the park and steal Paul? Did you want to harm him? But why? What have I done to you? We aren't even personally acquainted. Tell me the truth, and I'll leave." Isabella lowered her gaze, clearly ashamed. "Don't talk nonsense. If I wanted to harm him, I would have. Why did I attack you? Well, because before you came into our lives, I had it all, a beloved husband and prosperity. But you took it all away from me. Irene, taking the back, pulled a photo of the late Robert from her bag and handed it to Isabella. I'm not Bradley's lover, he's my late husband's brother, that's all. Do you understand what it was like for me to be pregnant after my husband's death? Thank you to Bradley for extending his help. He's just taking care of his nephew, that's it. But even if we had a relationship, why would you steal a child and take him to the countryside? Isabella suddenly grabbed her head. Don't interrogate me, it's like something possessed me. I lost my mind with jealousy and anger. I wanted to hurt you, to get revenge, and it seems like I succeeded. But it didn't bring me any relief. I was so scared when the baby slept for so long. I must have overdone it with the sleeping pills, he just wouldn't wake up. So, I left him with that old lady, hoping she'd take care of him. I'm sorry I got myself into a mess. It's only in prison that I realized I no longer love Bradley, just as he doesn't love me. I clung to him and never let go. But was it worth it? I ruined my life and yours too. It's a pity that nothing can change now. Irene asked quietly, but what if everything could change? What would you do? Isabella responded, I would leave. Forever by the sea and start a new life from a clean slate. But alas, that's impossible. And she began to cry quietly, sincerely trembling with every fiber of her being. Isabella was taken away while Irene remained seated for a long time, lost in thought. When Bradley learned that Irene had withdrawn her complaint, he was indignant. What are you doing? Why? Isabella must face the consequences for everything she's done. Irene stubbornly replied, she's already being punished. Her conscience will torment her for the rest of her life. Everyone has the right to correct their mistake and start over. Bradley moved into Irene's house and gradually began to put everything in order there. He had divorced his wife, and she indeed left and never appeared in their lives again, just as she had promised. Irene and Bradley together raised Paul, rejoicing in his first steps. And between them, a new bright and pure feeling blossomed, the sincere, profound love for each other. Thank you for joining us today on Deep Stories. Be sure to like and subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on our next video.